welcome to the Clinical Research Forum for July. I'm really pleased to introduce our IRB team, Catherine Rogers, Jesse Johnson, and Jocelyn Stengel, who are going to be talking about reportable events today. If you have questions, make sure to pop those in the chat and we'll be monitoring that to make sure we can get your questions answered. But at this time, I will go ahead and hand it over to the team and they can get started.
Hi, everyone. My name's Catherine Rogers, and I'm going to start this off, and then I'll hand it over to Jesse and Jocelyn for a little bit later. So today, we're going to be talking about, as Betsy said, reportable events, which is kind of a catch-all term for all of the things that need to be reported to the IRB that aren't like changes of protocol or continuing review, and we'll go over kind of what that term means and what it encapsulates and when to report. Okay, so today, like I said, we're going to go over the categories of reportable event, what that term really captures, some examples of common reportable events that we see very often, what the IRB does with those. A lot of people kind of report and then hope for the best and aren't exactly sure what kinds of things the IRB is considering, and they just wait in panic sometimes about what they're going to hear back. So the kinds of things that the IRB considers when reviewing reportable events, and then the determinations that we actually make under the regulations when we review reportable events. And then, of course, the timeframes for reporting. So when you become aware of something that happened on your study, what are your obligations when you report to the IRB? So those are our main objectives. So types of reportable events. The three main types that you're probably very familiar with that we use here are noncompliance, potential unanticipated problems, and Jesse will go over in a bit why potential is underlined, and then new information, which is truly reportable events, kind of a catch-all term. New information is kind of the most catch-all term for everything that doesn't really fall under one of the other two categories, noncompliance or unanticipated problems. So these are the main categories. When we moved to Toolkit, which is probably a term that you are all familiar with now, that is our library of resource documents for IRB staff to review, for IRB members to review, and for researchers to use as they prepare materials for the IRB. The toolkit materials, and in particular, our investigator manual, which hopefully you're familiar with. If you're not familiar with, it is linked on our website, and we provide a link at the end of the presentation. Doesn't exactly organize it in terms of those three main categories: noncompliance, unanticipated and problems, and new information. It organizes it more in terms of examples of kinds of things you would need to report, when you would need to report it, and then it breaks it out into broader categories for VA studies, which broadly align with non-VA studies, except for a few time frame requirements. Guidance on what does not need to be reported, which includes subject deviations from the study protocol, changes to eliminate an apparent immediate hazard, and corrective action plans. So all the information is in there. It's just, you're not, if you're looking for a category that says non-compliance, you won't quite see that term like that in the investigator manual. It will be under our broad category of reportable events, and it will give you examples of the kinds of things that you would need to report as potential non-compliance. So that's just a little kind of bridge between those terms and what you might see when you're looking on our website. So we're going to start with, I think, probably the most common thing that we see in terms of reportable events, which is noncompliance. So what is noncompliance? Toolkit, again, what we follow here, and which is posted on our website and is available to investigators to use, is any failure to follow federal regulations, state laws, institutional policies, or anything that the IRB has approved. So your protocol, your consent forms, anything that we have approved and said, yes, you can do this. If you do not do that, if you don't follow institutional policy or federal regulations, even if it's not in your protocol, that is all non-compliance. So it's a pretty broad term. So anytime basically you do something that you were not approved to do, or that is not consistent with the regulations, or you don't do something that you were supposed to be doing, or that's required under the regulations, that would be considered as potential noncompliance, and you should consider whether it needs to be reported to the IRB or not. Does every single instance of noncompliance need to be reported? Thankfully, no. There is some outs that we have. If we got every single instance of something not adhering to your protocol, I think we would be absolutely overwhelmed with reportable events, and we wouldn't really be able to sift through and identify the ones that we really need to know about. So there are some categories of things that don't need to be reported, and that's what we're going to start with. So before we move to toolkit, we call this our exceptions and deviation guidance, and we get a lot of questions on this. In toolkit, it is rebranded guidance on what does not need to be reported and subject deviation from the study protocol. So these two tabs are in our investigator manual under that reportable event thing, and it will describe kind of a small subset of events that may not require the report to the IRB. It does allow study teams to make that determination. So you don't necessarily have to submit and wait for us to say, no, this doesn't need to be required. This doesn't need to be reported. I will note that if you're ever in doubt, and we go over this on another slide, and you're not sure if it meets those criteria for not requiring report, it's always safest to reach out to us and ask. You can reach out to ask the IRB or to Jesse or myself or Jocelyn and say, I think this meets criteria for not requiring report, but I just want to confirm. So you can always ask us. We prefer that. And then this third point is really important. This is specific, what does not need to be reported, to unintended events that have already occurred. This is not applicable to planned deviations from the protocol. So that's really, really important. So if you realize, oh, last week we brought a subject in and they were a week out of window for a visit, and we just realized it as we were looking back at their research chart, that could be something you want to consider if it needs to be reported or not. If you are saying next week, we know that we can't schedule these subjects within our windows and we need to bring them in outside of window, and we know we're going to have to do this, that does not apply. That is a change of protocol and it would need to be submitted. So this guidance only applies to things that have already occurred and they were unintentional. So deviations under the control of the study team. This is generally what people think of when you think of noncompliance, and this is something that either the study team or happened because of what we did here and not the subject, versus deviations that are the result of something the subject's behavior or action caused. Sometimes people say this is subject noncompliance. That's a little tricky. We evaluated it a little differently. Whether or not needs to be reported, we'll kind of go over. But really, we focus on actions that are under the control of the study team when we think of this. So study team deviations. An event does not require a report to the IRB if it meets all of the criteria. So it has to meet all of these bullet points. The event did not affect, nor did it have the potential to affect subjects' rights, safety, or welfare. You'll notice an asterisk. If your study involves any type of drug, investigational or not, if there was a dosing error, either underdosing or overdosing, those all require report. When we first released this guidance years and years ago, we would get questions saying, well, it was an underdosing and we know that it didn't affect safety. Those kinds of things, given the interventional nature of the study, need to be reported regardless, and the IRB will be the ones to make that determination if it had the potential to affect subject safety. So that's just a broad carve out. If it involved any sort of medication dosing error, it will require to be reported. It did not result in a change to the participant's clinical or emotional condition or status. It did not affect the integrity, accuracy, or reliability of research data. That's a big one. So if you're missing a big chunk of data and you're like, well, it didn't affect safety, it didn't affect the subject's condition, if it's a large chunk of data, that definitely could have the potential to affect the reliability or the integrity of research data, so that wouldn't fit. And the event did not result from willful or knowing misconduct on the part of the study team. So again, this goes back to that last point that I made on the previous slide. This was unintentional. It was not planned. There was no forethought to this. It just kind of happened. So those are the kinds of things that wouldn't need to be reported. The things that I think come to mind when we think of these, and anything could affect safety, so you have to judge each event individually, but things that we typically see, well, that probably meets this criterion, doesn't need to be reported, is a single out of visit window. So a subject came in a week late, there was a scheduling snafu, but no safety labs were missed. Something like that might meet those criteria. A single instance of a missed questionnaire. So you administer a battery of research questionnaires and surveys. One or two were missed for a single visit, but that's just one data point. All the rest of the data looks good. It was just an error. They weren't in the packet. That might meet criteria for not needing to be reported. So those are the kinds of things that we generally see when we're talking about deviations that don't require a report to the IRB.
Catherine, we have a question in the chat about giving an example of an event that would affect the accuracy of the study data. I think those are rarer than we expect. I mean, obviously, you know, any sort of deviation or non-compliance from the protocol has the ability to affect, you know, at least one or two pieces of data. But what we're talking about in general is like the data of the study as a whole. So it would have to be something that would have a rather, you know, large effect on, I mean, the thing that comes to mind is we used to, some of the research studies that work with PSA levels. And there was a issue a very long time ago with using outside labs versus UW labs and having different ways of calculating PSA. And that was a, you know, obviously an integral part to the aims and the study. So that would be something, you know, even though it didn't necessarily like affect subject safety, it was just about reporting the data. That was something that required reporting to us because it ended up having two different equations for calculating the PSA. So that affected the data that was collected on PSAs outside versus UW. And they had to find a way to kind of like control for that. I don't know if you have any other examples, but I would say those are probably the rarer ones. Usually it's more along the lines of what kicks it out of not needing reporting to needing reporting is affecting subject safety. That's the most common one I think that we see.
Hey, Jessica, another one that we see a lot is like sometimes the outcome measurement is not on the same time frame as the clinical measurement. So maybe you do a tumor measurement normally at 12 months, but the protocol requires it at 9 months and it gets missed. That is the outcome measurement for the study. So that's a big deal, even though clinically it's not a measurement that we would normally make.
That's an
excellent. So there's another example that's sort of pretty clear cut where it would affect the study, but not the patient clinically.
And those are the kind of assessments that the study team should make as they're going through those bullets to say, like, yes, it potentially could. So any deviation, whether you go through those bullets and decide it ultimately does not need report to the IRB or it does need to be reported to the IRB, you still need to document that. So if it's a deviation that you clearly said, oh, it fits this exception criteria, it's a single event, it was a missed questionnaire, it doesn't require a report to the IRB, you should still note that. You should still have your audit trail, your records clear, and so still make a note. Again, our criteria on exceptions and deviations applies to a single event. If this is happening over and over, it's happened 2 times, 3 times, you're continuously bringing in subjects out of window, or you're missing the same lab over and over, even though it's not a safety lab, that suggests there's something else that we need to maybe troubleshoot or look into, and maybe the process can be refined. So that's when it would need to be a report. So this is a single event. If it happened twice and it's extremely minor and you're like, I still feel like maybe, that's when you reach out to the IRB. And you say, it is a single missed questionnaire. It happened twice, but it's because, you know, it's the same person and we scheduled these at the same time. And it really is kind of like a single event. It just happened to happen twice. Reach out to the IRB and we can help you decide if that needs to be a report. But in general, this is referring only to one instance of this happening. And again, this is very important. This is intended for things that have already happened, not planned actions, intended exceptions or deviations. So if you know you're going to have to do something that deviates from your protocol, your consent form, or deviates in some way from institutional policy, that needs to be submitted to the IRB as a change of protocol prior to implementation. Now, if the carve out for that is if it's to eliminate an apparent immediate hazard. So if you have a subject in and something is going wrong and you're like, our protocol requires us to dose this medication in this way, but something is clearly going wrong and we are not going to, we need to not do that. That would be to eliminate an apparent immediate hazard. That doesn't happen often, and those are usually an unanticipated problem and kind of a big deal when you have to deviate because something is clearly going wrong right then in the minute. You can do what you need to do because obviously subject safety always comes first. But in general, if you are planning to deviate in some way, you need to submit that as a change of protocol prior to implementation. Subject deviations, we get a lot of questions on this. Things that are outside of the control of the study team, but obviously we're working with subjects, humans, they can do all kinds of things. You can give them instructions they don't quite follow. When does that need to be reported? So deviations that are the result of a subject's behavior generally do not require a report unless it meets any of the criteria. So it just has to meet one of these. So the incident suggests that a subject's safety is being affected. It adversely impinges upon the integrity, again, accuracy or reliability of the research data obtained from the subject. So if they have very specific instructions, you know, in terms of like taking the study medication that they're sent home with, and they are not following these at all, their safety could be affected, and it could really affect the quality of the data you're getting from that subject. Or a pattern of protocol deviations that suggests that the protocol itself might need to change. And we do have examples of this. We have one protocol in particular that comes to mind that had very kind of complicated and burdensome dosing instructions. They had to take a lot of pills. They had to take a lot of pills per day. They had to take them at specific times, with food, without food. And they had a lot of problems with subjects not being able to understand and adhere to that. And they weren't taking the medication properly. And they were seeing that in the medication diaries that they brought back in. So the study team was doing everything appropriately. They had it all written out. They had instructions, but it was just not being, when they operationalized that, they saw subjects just really aren't able to adhere to this. And it's causing problems, again, with that second bullet point, potentially reliability of research data and potentially even subject safety. So at that point, do you need to change the protocol to make it easier for subjects to follow these instructions, and what can we do? So if you start seeing like subjects over and over aren't able to, you know, do the thing that you're asking them to do, that suggests a bigger problem, and that would probably need to be submitted as a reportable event. And then at that point, consider whether there's changes to the protocol that would need to be made. But, you know, an example of, we get a lot, like a subject missed a visit, or a subject didn't return a phone call, they didn't answer the questionnaire at this point. That's when you would go through these 3 bullet points. Was it a safety visit? If it wasn't, if it was just, you know, we're doing this and you were able to make contact on the phone later and you can ensure that their safety wasn't impacted, and then they came to all their other visits, that kind of thing probably wouldn't need to be reported. Okay, so once you determine that noncompliance does need to be submitted, it does not fall into these 2 carve-outs. So you say, yes, we actually have the potential to do any of these things. We need to submit this noncompliance to the IRB. You would go into Arrow, you would select new reportable event. And within that, you can say that you're submitting a noncompliance report. And then it walks you through a series of questions about what happened, when you became aware, what did you do about it? And then you submit to the IRB. And I think this is where, for a lot of people, it's a black hole. What do we do? So the IRB is charged with determining under the regulations whether it is serious and or continuing noncompliance. Serious noncompliance involves substantive harm or genuine risk of substantive harm to the safety, rights, and welfare of research participants or others, or potentially decreases the benefits or compromises the integrity of the human research protection program. So that's a lot of information. The first involves substantive harm or genuine risk of harm. I think the important piece there is nothing bad necessarily might have happened, but could it have happened, and were you just lucky that it didn't? So those are the kinds of things that we consider there. So if it was I'm going to go with a dosing error because that's kind of easy. If it was an overdose, but you say the subject was fine, they had no adverse events, nothing bad happened. How likely was it that something bad could have happened? So that's what the IRB would consider. What was the drug? What was the dosage that was given? What would be the dosage that was given clinically? What was the monitoring? What are the risks of this drug? And if the IRB says, wow, they're really lucky that the subject was okay, given what happened, that might, veer into serious noncompliance category. Whereas we might say, oh, that's a really low risk drug. That dosing error was nominal. It was very minimal. That's less than what we would give clinically. And it's very unlikely that would have caused any harm. The IRB would consider that in making that determination. Decreases potential benefit or compromises the integrity of the human research protection program. That last one is when we tend to make those determinations when we really see systemic problems going on that suggest a bigger system issue, that some fundamental piece of the research enterprise is being missed, like major errors in obtaining informed consent, for example, are the kinds of things that go into that. So the IRB will consider whether it meets the criteria for serious noncompliance, and then does it also or separately meet the criteria for continuing noncompliance? It can be one or the other, or it can be both. Continuing noncompliance is multiple or repeated instances of noncompliance, particularly after written notice from the IRB, or that after corrective actions have been implemented. So that last bit is very important. You could have had an instance, or a study team could have had several instances of noncompliance that they discover all at once. For example, we were looking back at our research records and we realized that 10 subjects were consented with the wrong consent form, and it was missing this bit of information. So you might think, well, that's continuing noncompliance. It happened to 10 subjects. Not necessarily. If you discovered it all at once, all of those errors happened at the same time period, we would kind of consider that as one event. And we would say, what are your corrective actions? And the study team would say, here's what we're going to do. We're retraining. We're printing consents directly from Arrow. Here's all the ways we're going to prevent this from happening. And we say, okay, implement those, do that. A month later, you realize it happened again. 5 more subjects were consented with the incorrect consent form. That is when the IRB might consider, is this continuing noncompliance? They had the same thing happen, they implemented these corrective actions, and now the exact same thing is happening again. What is leading to that? What didn't we address the first time? So it's not necessarily that it happened more than once, it's that it happened again after you were made aware of the error and after you took steps to prevent it from occurring again. Continuing noncompliance may occur on one or more studies that and may occur over a period of time. So if you have the same study team over 5 studies and the same thing happened on all studies at different time periods, the IRB would potentially consider whether that constitutes continuing noncompliance as well. So the IRB considers serious noncompliance, continuing noncompliance. If we make a determination that it is one or both of these, serious and or continuing, investigators, we always make a preliminary determination. So investigators will always have a chance to kind of respond and say, here's some mitigating information. Here's some additional information that we found in our investigation of this. We would like the IRB to consider this. Once we finalize that finding, then we report that to the institutional official here on campus. And then depending on funding and other regulatory oversight, we would potentially report that finding to OHRP and or the FDA. A note about that, I know that that is not ideal. We don't want that to happen. But we do have these occur and we do report, some of these each year. So I know that that's one thing that study teams get very nervous about, and we try to avoid that, at all costs. But reporting does happen, and we can kind of walk you through the process of what that looks like. I'll just pause here and see if there's any questions that we need to address now about noncompliance.
We were just getting some questions about reliant when it occurs on a study where we've seeded review, and that Travis gave me, I copied and put in the chat, the exact information as it's written in the reliance manual. The general rule is you follow the reporting requirements of the IRB of record. So for studies that occur at UW where we haven't seeded, that's our reporting requirements. So you start there with whatever the IRB of record, if we've seeded to, WRB or someone else, what their reporting requirements are. And then as it says in the chat, there are a few instances where we might also want it reported to us in addition to the IRB of record, but that's those are pretty particular cases. And that's something that you would just probably either contact the Reliant team or call us and we can discuss with the Reliant team, but either way, we'll get it figured out. But in general, you follow the reporting requirements of the IRB of record that is doing your review. So.
Okay, so some common examples. These are ones we see pretty frequently of non-compliance that requires report consented subjects using old, either expired, incorrect versions of consent form. Whether or not that's serious depends on the differences of the consent form. We've had ones where it's just minor, oh, we made some editorial errors and they were consented on the previous version. That is not going to be serious. We've had ones where they're like, we consented them with a version of the consent form that is missing a whole risk section and they weren't not given the risk information for this investigational drug or device. That is a bigger deal. Administering different versions of research questionnaires, storing study data in a manner that differs from what was specified in the protocol. An example of serious noncompliance, failure to complete HIV testing when screening for subject eligibility, subjects discharged without meeting discharge criteria for a protocol. So if you say we're going to do this intervention, we're going to monitor them for 2 hours afterwards and they have to hit specific criteria, and if they hit those criteria at these time points, then they'll be discharged. And if that wasn't adhered to, you discharged them too early, you didn't take those measurements, or they didn't hit the criteria for discharge and they were released anyway, that obviously is non-compliance and that could potentially be serious as well. And then continuing, of course, repeat consenting issues and errors, that comes up pretty frequently. Multiple instances of failing to submit safety amendments within IRB required timeframes. That's an interesting one too. We have requirements for when you're informed of new risk or safety information, you have to tell the IRB that in a certain amount of time. And if continuously that's not happening and we're not getting this until well after the study team was made aware of it, that's something that we might consider to be continuing non-compliance and required to be submitted as a reportable event. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Jesse now to talk about unanticipated problems. And Jesse, just tell me when you want slides advanced.
Sure. I'm going to take a moment here and just, pause to acknowledge that, reportable events are scary. It's not fun to have to, call the IRB and determine if something needs reporting. And they're also really confusing. It's why this has been a team of just me, and then it was me and Catherine, and then it was me, Catherine, and Jocelyn, why it's kept kind of so close in-house to just a group of people who really understand the situation, because it's confusing for us as well too. And like almost every question somebody, like the slide where Catherine had the examples of the non-compliances, like it's hard to even come up with those where there isn't some context that would make something that seems like the consent form error that seems like no big deal. There's always a context where that same error could occur and it would be a really big deal. And I just want to acknowledge that, I think we're going to be handing out these slides at the end too. So there's active links in there and you can look at, but like, if you're ever unsure, you can just contact one of us. We're not scary. I mean, Jocelyn's very scary, but I'm not scary. So it's okay. She'll yell at you. I won't. No, I'm just, but we are here to help. I mean, we're obviously, and weirdly enough, people think, there used to be this adage that like, oh, the IRB is trying to catch us. you know, things that are incorrect and things like that. And it's really like, we don't want you reporting stuff to us if it doesn't need to be reported either. Like, same team, it's that kind of thing, which is why I love the guidance we have now in the toolkit for what doesn't need to be reported. It's much easier to understand. It's much more simple to double check. And if you ever have a question, you know, just shoot us an email, and we love to be helpful. I promise you, it's not as scary as it sounds. And also we can help with, you know, if it's a really weird situation and it might be kind of outside the box, we can figure out a solution, you know, to get it reviewed before it happens if you come across those cases. So I just want to acknowledge that, like, when you hear all this stuff in a presentation all together all at once, it sounds really like scary and, you know, authoritative and things like that. But really we're here to help, and we're always there to explain something to you if you need it. So like, please just feel free to reach out to us if you ever have any questions. So probably the most hardest out of all the categories of reportable events to understand, the most confusing, I guess I would say, is unanticipated problems. And the reason is because when non-compliance gets reported to the IRB, you know it's non-compliant with whatever, the protocol, the consent form, the, you know, enrollment processes, you know, blah, blah, blah. You know it's non-compliant. And then the IRB takes the step of reviewing it to see if it's serious or continuing, or serious and continuing. So we're kind of assessing the level of the non-compliance. With unanticipated problems, all the IRB needs to assess is whether it actually meets the formal definition, the regulatory definition is laid out on this slide. So you are going to be reporting things that you think have the potential to meet this definition. And a lot of times it might be clear even to the study team that it very much does meet all three of these criteria and thus needs to be reported. But sometimes it can be a borderline thing. And that's where unanticipated problems can get a little murky. And that's where we also encourage you, if you're like, it's borderline, we're not sure, to give us a call, and we can, you know, discuss whether it needs to be reported. And I'll go through the criteria in a moment, but if you're ever unsure and for some reason you're unable to get a hold of us and it's a Friday and the weekend is coming up, I always say err on reporting, just as a side of caution, like erring on the side of caution, and report it. If you think it has the potential to meet all three of these criteria, then probably report it. And at worst, you'll get a review that says, you know, we looked at it and it doesn't meet the definition. So when you and us, when we are reviewing unanticipated problem reports that come in, it has to meet all three of these criteria in order to meet that formal definition of an unanticipated problem. So it has to be unexpected, which you might guess by the name unanticipated problem. It has to be unexpected, unanticipated. This can happen in several ways. It can be the nature of the event. People are having, you know, pulmonary embolisms, and we had no idea that was going to be a side effect of this study drug. It can be in the severity. So people could be getting like week-long migraines that they're hospitalized over, and you knew the drug, you know, the risk of headache was listed in the consent form. You knew it was probably going to give the headaches, but you had no idea that it was going to be to the severity of like a hospitalized migraine. And or the frequency of the event. So you may have something listed as a very rare event that you're finding is occurring very frequently on your study, and you did not expect every single subject that's enrolled thus far to have this very rare, you know, event occur with them, and that would be unexpected in the frequency the event is occurring and could potentially require reporting. The other thing is the event has to be reasonably related to the research. And what we mean by reasonably related is like more likely than not, the event that you're evaluating was caused by study participation. The Cancer Center has the categories of definitely related, probably related, possibly related, or not related. That's how they categorize. And we always say If it's definitely or probably, that's an easy automatic report to the IRB. The possibly ones are the ones that we'd ask you to call us, because that's kind of on the fence about whether you could say more likely than not that is related. And in general, if you're unsure, we always say just err on the side of caution and report. And then the event itself has to cause a greater risk of harm, whether it be physical, psychological, economic, or social harm. I mean, in general, most often it's going to be something that's physically harmful to a subject, meaning a new adverse event you didn't know about before. And we can go to the next one. So like I was saying, I got ahead of myself and said this slide already, but unanticipated problems, you're reporting those to us if you think there's a possibility that it meets all three of those criteria. Like I said, sometimes you'll know, it'll be very evident. It's a brand new risk. It happened, you know, immediately after study drug administration with the first like it was very obviously caused by study participation. And so you might know reporting to us, oh yeah, this is definitely an unanticipated problem. And then most likely it will be something that you're kind of on the fence about and might be related, or there might be some question of whether it's really unexpected because the consent form said X and the event was Y, and they're very similar. And again, that is always something that, you know, give us a call, we can discuss. The context of the study documents are all things we look through to determine whether something is unexpected or not, beyond just the consent form, things like the IDB, the protocol, things like that. But we will then, when we review it, that's where the final and formal determination of whether it meets the definition of an unanticipated problem happens, is with the IRB. And not all potential UPs have to go to a full committee for that decision. Sometimes it just requires a medical reviewer to look through, and a single IRB member. Usually we're sending that to a chair or a vice chair or some IRB member with medical expertise in the area the event that occurred was in. But not all of them need to go to full committee to have that evaluated. So that can happen, you know, kind of outside of a meeting, or it can require a full committee to make that determination. If we are fairly certain that it does meet the definition of an unanticipated problem, that's when we're going to send it to full committee. Because that is a formal determination, just like serious and continuing non-compliance, that requires reporting outside the institution usually, or at the very least, additional reporting. So that is something that the full committee has to make the decision for. But if we get it and we're fairly certain that, you know, it does not meet the definition for whatever reason, we might send that to a medical reviewer outside of the meeting to make that determination. And yeah, the reporting in general, if it's, you know, a study involving an investigational drug or device, those items get reported to the FDA outside the institution. We have had cases where it's not an FDA regulated study, there's no investigational drug or device, and it's not federally funded, and those unanticipated problems end up just getting reported to UW's institutional official, Nadine Connor. So sometimes the reporting is in-house, but if the study is FDA regulated, it will get reported to the FDA. And if the study is federally funded, it will get reported to OHRP. And sometimes it can get reported to all three, FDA, OHRP, and the institutional official. It all depends on the regulatory nature of the study. And go to the next one. So the most common examples we have for unanticipated problems is, you know, a new risk. So it's a drug or device study, or even, you know, just a study that doesn't involve any of that, but you're administering an exercise test in a specific subject population, and everyone is falling and like having severe injuries from, you know, whatever exercise test, and that wasn't something that you expected to happen. That could be an example, but in general, this is where you kind of think of those physical adverse events that occur that you either didn't know about before, or you knew about, but they're happening more severely or at a greater frequency. and like that second example, it can be a previously known risk, but it's unexpected in how frequently or how severely it's happening. Additional examples of things that don't fall under that pretty straightforward umbrella of an adverse event is something that we would want reported as a potential unanticipated problem would be those times that Catherine mentioned previously where there's you need to implement a change prior to IRB review to eliminate an immediate hazard to a subject. The example I always remember from a long time ago was there was some, the sponsor had an immediate press release about the increased risk nature of intermuscular injection of a research drug, and that had previously been administered to subjects IM, and they were now saying you have to stop that and immediately start administering it via IV, via these parameters, because of the risk of that was occurring. And so obviously, we would want you to do that right away. If you had a subject coming in that day, you would administer the drug IV per the instructions, and you would follow that up with a unanticipated problem report, which in those cases kind of acts as a placeholder for real-time review of this change, and then to make sure that nothing else needs to be occurring while we're, getting the change of protocol ready for submission, to have that formally reviewed and implemented into the protocol. The other example is the subject becomes a prisoner while on study. I think this is still something. I mean,
was just thinking that I don't know if we have to report that anymore, but we might have to report it.
Right. I think we've become study teams are really good at knowing their subject populations and whether there's a potential for their subject population to become incarcerated during study participation, because study participation may just involve online questionnaires. And so a lot of times they will build in that potential into their protocol and say, as soon as we become aware that someone becomes incarcerated, we will cease all study participation, but we'll allow the option to pick it back up once they are not incarcerated anymore. And people have started to build those into their protocols, particularly like the smoking cessation protocols do that a lot. So that actually eliminates the need to submit a UP to us for those anymore. But certainly if this occurred on a study where you were not expecting somebody to become incarcerated during study participation, and or this would be very rare, but someone accidentally participated in a study while they were incarcerated. The one example I can think of is somebody, it was a recruit in hospital for people having some sort of clinical kidney biopsy, and they consented them to provide like extra biopsy tissue from their clinical biopsy. And there was a prisoner that was receiving treatment at the UW hospital who was enrolled on that study because for whatever reason, the police officer outside the door didn't clue anybody in that this was a prisoner. And those would definitely need to be reported to us as a potential unanticipated problem. But again, those are very rare, and most likely now study teams are very good at knowing their subject populations and building that into their protocols ahead of time. And then the last is the example when we think back to when Catherine was talking about subject noncompliance and those criteria about when subject noncompliance needs to be reported to the IRB. And that is the kind of events where, the subject is so non-compliant with the protocol that they are now, maybe they're administering study drug at home to themselves and they're coming back with drug diaries. They're incomplete, they're missing medication, those have the potential to affect subject safety because they're administering study drug at home to themselves. And it's possible that those, even though it's not non-compliance on the part of the study team, would need to be reported to us. And that's why we break those off specifically into the potential UP category, because it isn't non-compliance on the part of the study team. It's, unexpected that the subject would be that non-compliant with the study protocol. So we reserve UPs for those. And I think, is that the UP? Am I done? Am I done? Is there one more?
Sorry, I lost my control tab. I was going to say that these are not always, they're often physically related, but we do have ones where like, you know, a psychological battery is causing more distress in their subject population than they had anticipated. These can be weird one-off things too. Like this subject had a very unusual reaction to this and was distressed and requested to withdraw and had a highly emotional reaction. These can be really, they don't always have to be a pattern. They're often not a pattern. It can be a one-time thing that just was really something that was out of the norm that the study team wasn't expecting, that suggested a subject was experiencing something that may be increased risk to them. So it's not always physical. It can be, but there are some very unusual situations that can come up in any number of ways that the study team just wasn't expecting, didn't plan for, and were concerning in some way. And that the kind of thing
made me think of something, subject complaints that are unresolvable. You know, it rises, just like Catherine said, to the level where the subject is getting extremely upset and it's something that the study team just can't resolve, or it's an ongoing issue or something to that effect. Those could have the potential to need to be reported to us. We also easily resolved and very simple subject complaints. You tell us about those at continuing review, but those bigger ones where it involves, you know, and we hope these don't happen for the subject's sake and for the study team's sake, because they never seem very pleasant to have to go through, but there's the potential that those could need reporting to us too. And this is everybody's favorite, and by favorite, I mean haunts their dreams at night, including mine, flow chart of when does a UP need to be reported to the IRB. And so the kind of, this has stuck around though for, I mean, it's been here pretty much as over 13 years, as long as I've been here. And it still is very helpful, and it looks intimidating, but it is just, you start there, and it carves out a very limited special path for device studies, which isn't really that different from drug studies, but there's some particular language that the FDA uses that's slightly different for devices. And then the other item to note for device studies is the reporting time frame is 10 days instead of 14 days. So that's the main difference why they carve that side out for device studies only. But if it's not a device study, then you go through and, you know, it essentially asks you those 3 questions, but in flowchart form. Was the event probably related to study participation? Was it unexpected, either in nature, frequency, or severity? Is it a subject death or something that's immediately life-threatening? And you can see, if you say yes to that, that goes to what we call like our OMG reporting timelines, which is where you're giving Lisa Wilson a call as the IRB director, you're calling Catherine, you're calling me, and that is something that gets reported that day, kind of thing. Those are extremely rare, and I think maybe have only happened once or twice in my entire time doing reportable events. So those are very, very rare. And then just to point out too, we used to, very long time ago, used to want to know about like every subject death that occurred on the study, regardless of relatedness. That's no longer the case. It would have to be, you know, a subject death that was caused by study participation. But then I mean, I think it's kind of intuitive if somebody died because of study participation, that clearly would need to be reported to the IRB. But those unrelated subject deaths, we don't need to know about anymore, especially given, you know, certain studies have subjects with, you know, treatment refractory cancer, and there's going to be subject deaths, unfortunately, on that study, but they're not necessarily related to the study participation. And then, you know, go through, does the event suggest that the research places subjects at greater risk of harm? And then this last bit is meant to kind of carve out those situations where it may be borderline about whether the event was related to study participation or not, but you know the protocol is going to change because of that one event, then you probably need to be reporting that to us. Because even if you know, we ultimately determine that it doesn't meet all three of those criteria, it's still something that basically big picture on the outset, if an event happens and you're making a change to the protocol, that has the very clear potential to look like an unanticipated problem, and therefore needs a more formal determination by the IRB about whether it's actually an unanticipated problem or not. So that's it. Now I hand it over to the meanest girl you'll ever see. I joke because she's the nicest ever, Jocelyn.
All right. Thank you, Catherine and Jesse. Thanks also Betsy and Rochelle for having us. So I'm Jocelyn Stengel. I use she, her pronouns. I'm also one of the analysts that reviews reportable events. And I'm going to be talking about the third category, new information. As Catherine mentioned earlier, it's kind of a catch-all. It's everything else that we also want to be reported, sometimes called NI report for short. So thanks, Catherine. So kind of this first chunk, new information that may affect a subject's willingness to participate in the study, which includes notifying the IRB of new risk information related to a forthcoming change of protocol. So here, that new information report is serving as a placeholder until the change can be submitted. Also, information that has the potential to affect the criteria for IRB approval and requires additional action by the study team. I've got some specific examples on the next slide. Kind of the second category. Oh, go back to the other slide. I'll get to the examples. So like I said, catch-all category. So this is something that you need to tell us, but none of the other submissions, like a change, non-compliance report, potential UP report, none of those other categories really make sense. And so we have some specific things that we allow to come in as these new information reports. Some of them are included on that list of reporting requirements that Catherine mentioned earlier. And then there are some other types that are kind of referenced throughout the investigator manual and other places. So first kind of bullet, the FDA audit reports, regardless of findings, should be submitted to the IRB. We want to know if the FDA audits your study and not just if they are reportable findings. Temporary leave of the principal investigator can be submitted as a new information report. We would not require a change of protocol if the PI is expected to return and resume, their responsibilities. And so our changes in principal investigator guidance kind of outlines when it's a change, when a new information report can be submitted. So you can also submit a new NI report if you have subject correspondence not previously approved by the IRB. This does not mean like recruitment material or consent materials. Those come in as changes of protocols. So here we often see letters informing participants of like the overall results of the study, again, not individual results. So for example, your study's finished, you want to tell all the subjects, thanks again for participating, we've completed the study, we've proven that hypothesis or whatever. You can submit that as a new information report. And kind of our final bullet point, new information reports can also be used to request the release of individual participant incidental findings when your study does not have an approved plan for doing so. Again, this would be for a single subject. Maybe you see something clinically relevant during a scan and want to inform the participant of it and recommend some sort of clinical follow-up. Next slide, Catherine. So as promised, some examples. Our first one is like you've received an investigator brochure that has for the study drug, and it includes new risk information. You know that there will be a forthcoming change of protocol to add that risk information to the protocol and consent form, but it will not be available to be submitted to the IRB within 14 days. So this is when you submit the new information report, letting us know about the new risk information. And, you know, you're typically saying that we will be telling participants verbally of this new risk information until they can be reconsented with the revised consent form. So also an unexpected change in study status is also appears to impact safety and or the ability of the study to meet its original aims. Like the last example, this is an example of one that impacts the risk-benefit ratio of the study. You know, when the IRB approves the study, they're basing that on certain risks and the ability to create generalizable knowledge. So if the information that is the basis for that approval changes, then the risk-benefit ratio may be impacted. And so that's when you're coming back to us, just letting us know, here's this new information. So some specific examples would be a halt to study enrollment due to equipment malfunction or drug supply issues. Again, these are unexpected changes in study status, so not expected halts to perform an interim analysis or meeting your enrollment goal. PI taking maternity or paternal leave. And then our final example, requesting to disclose a lab finding for a single subject, and the study is not approved to provide lab results to subjects. So you can submit to us to release just to that single subject. So unlike non-compliance, where we're evaluating serious or continuing, whether it meets those definitions, or with potential UPs where we're evaluating if it meets the formal definition of a UP, there's usually not a formal determination to be made with these new information reports. And just again, whenever you submit into Arrow, where you're asked to select, which category. And it is helpful if you do make the right selection, but we're always evaluating that on our end, so don't stress out if you don't get it exactly right. Next slide. Next slide. So on to our last objective, timeframes for reporting reportable events. I'll go through this quickly because I know we're coming up on time. So like Jesse mentioned, our OMG reports, you have to call these into the director within 1 day. These events that are probably related, unexpected, and immediately life-threatening or severely debilitating. Okay, if you're doing VA research, the reporting requirements, so the types of things you report, it's all the same, but you have to report within 5 days for VA studies. As Jesse noted, there's some specific things with the device regulations, so potential UPs for device studies, you have to submit those within 10 business days. And then for everything else, you have to report within 14 business days. Again, I think Catherine mentioned this earlier, but that clock starts when the RE is discovered. So for example, if you're doing a self-audit of your consent forms and you notice you used the wrong consent form when consenting a participant, say 3 months ago, following a change of protocol, the 14 business days starts when you discovered that non-compliance during the audit. You are not already in violation of our reporting timeframes because the event occurred, more than 14 days ago and it hasn't been reported yet. So once you find it, that's when the clock starts. Again, I would refer you to our reporting requirements for more details on all of this. And we also have some guidance on when you have to report, what information you should include in that reportable event. So there's that one there. And kind of finally, just if you have any questions, we also have a slide with all of our contact information, and then kind of a consolidation of all those links that we saw or that were throughout the presentation. There's a final slide with everything on it.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn, Jesse, and Catherine. It looks like we do have quite a few questions here, and we're sort of running out of time. So I don't know if there are a few that maybe would be appropriate to answer right now. It looks like a lot of them have been answered within the chat as well. So I would advise folks, if they do have questions, this team has really graciously said that they're available for you to reach out to them. So if you have specific questions, perhaps you can go ahead and reach out to them to get your specific questions answered. But thank you all so much. This was a absolutely fabulous presentation and really, really helpful.